What is the scariest true story you personally experienced? Story 1. While at university, my friends and I ran out of alcohol. Hardly any shops were open because it was late, so the only option was to walk about a mile or so to the nearest 24-hour supermarket. Between the supermarket and the dorms we lived in, there was just row after row of suburban houses that all looked the same. As we were walking down one road, we passed a field with a large campfire and some people riding horses around it. There were people playing musical instruments, and there were general sounds of a good time going on, and the horses, the fire, and the lanterns dotted around gave it a very old-fashioned feel. Maybe 5 minutes after passing the field, now walking past houses again, one of my friends commented on how weird and out of place that gathering of people had been. My other friend and I had been thinking exactly the same thing. So curious, we turned around and walked back to find out exactly what was going on. There was nothing there. Not just no people or horses. There was no field at all, just more and more houses. Even though we were absolutely certain we were on the right road, since we had simply turned around, we walked up and down the neighboring roads too. We found nothing. We were not drunk, though we had had some drinks, and I still have absolutely no idea what happened that night. Story 2. The scariest thing I have ever had happen while camping. I live in Eastern Oregon, and my mom lives in Western Oregon. I went to visit her for the summer, and she is very outdoorsy, so we decided to take the 1-hour drive from her city to the coast. We ended up at this free campsite at the top of a hill, huge foothills of the coastal mountains, about a 25-minute drive from the top, where the campsite was, to the bottom, where the main road was. And we were the only campers there. We relaxed for the rest of the day, made food, and just enjoyed ourselves. A truck full of men drove up the hill and talked with my mom. I do not know what about, and it was not suspicious at the time, and then they left. Fast forward to the middle of the night. I woke up to my mom sitting straight up in the tent. I wake easily, so I heard her gasp and it woke me. As soon as she saw I was awake, she put her hand over my mouth because I was starting to ask her what was wrong. It was completely silent, and all of a sudden we heard footsteps right beside the tent. The little flap that covers the zipper was even moving. Thankfully, my mom has quick wits and said very loudly, "Kenny, grab the gun. Kenny is my dad," although that does not really matter, and he was not there. It was just us girls, like I said before. Whoever it was left. No harm was done. Thank the Lord for my mom. Story 3. I was camping in a valley by myself with no cell service. I stayed late on a trail and ran into a nice local guy as it was getting dark. He showed me a local camping spot close to the road and the river, but well camouflaged. I had a fire, drank beer, and listened to my friend's comedy podcast. I was loud and visible. Because it was already dark, I decided to sleep in the back of my truck, under my topper next to all of my gear, instead of setting up my tent. The next morning I made a fire, cracked a beer, and started making breakfast. Then I noticed there was a man at the edge of my camp. He came closer, but never looked directly at me. He looked homeless, had a long ratty beard, and had at least 100 plastic grocery bags tied all over his clothes. I commented on how nice the day was, but he did not respond. I offered him breakfast, nothing. He sort of paced around the perimeter of my camp. I offered him a beer, but he just turned around. He stood there with his back to me, wandering around. I realized there were not going to be any good outcomes. I kept my bear spray and buck knife very close. I finally gave him an ultimatum, telling him he was either going to acknowledge me or leave immediately. He ignored me. I grabbed the bear spray and walked a few steps toward him. He slunk away, and I threw my stuff in my truck and left that place very quickly. I still wonder if he watched me during the night, and I thank my laziness for staying in my truck instead of a tent. Story 4. 4 years ago, I lived in a very large farmhouse that had been converted into 2 apartments. The house was known as the Old Boys' Home. It had been used to house boys with behavioral issues, but was closed due to allegations of molestation. At the time, I was living there with my boyfriend and my 3-year-old daughter. My bedroom had a large fireplace that had been boarded up and painted over. One day while rearranging things, I decided to push my bed up against it like a headboard. That night, around 1 in the morning, I heard a small voice saying, "Mom, Mom, Mommy." I sat up in bed but did not see anything, so I reached over my boyfriend and tried to grab my daughter to pull her into our bed. I kept feeling around and I was still hearing the voice, but I could not feel her. My boyfriend woke up and turned on the bedside lamp, asking me what the hell I was doing. I explained that Amelia was trying to get into our bed and that I was reaching for her. There was nobody there. My daughter was sound asleep in her room. The next night, again around 1 in the morning, my dog started to whimper at the door, so my boyfriend got up to take him outside. You know that feeling in a bed when someone lies down next to you, when the bed dips and there is warmth against your back? I felt that and assumed my boyfriend had come back to bed. I rolled over and he was not there, and in that same second I felt the bed release pressure, like whatever had been lying next to me had gotten up. I moved my bed to the other side of the room the next day, and I never had another incident in the 2 years I remained in that house. Story 5. When my grandparents bought their house for a family of 10, my grandpa found a fake wall upstairs. He tore it down to make more room for the family. Behind the wall were children's clothes and toys, almost like someone had walled the room off in a hurry. My mom told me stories of sitting in her room and hearing something circling the walls around her, sounding like wallpaper being torn. When she moved out, my aunt moved into the same room. She would wake up in the morning with pictures she had hung on the wall lying on her chest. My cousins also have stories of hearing footsteps coming up the stairs and stopping right outside their door in the middle of the night. I still do not go upstairs in their house because it is always cold and I get strange vibes up there. Even in my adult life, I still have scary dreams that take place in their upstairs. Story 6. It is not as spooky as some other stories, but my significant other and I are still completely bewildered by it. Years have passed and we still wonder about it sometimes, and there is no explanation other than some strange connection or an unbelievably big coincidence. For about 10 years, my Nana has been living in a nursing home after having a stroke, and mentally she is not fully there. She still recognizes us when we visit and gets happy to see us, but she often talks nonsense, thinking she is living in a distant memory from the past. It makes me sad because we were always extremely close when I was growing up. My parents worked a lot and she stayed with me often. She always knew when I was lying, could sense when I was sick even if she was not around. And we are eerily similar in both personality and looks. There are photos of her at 21 years old and she looks exactly like me. I love her dearly. I introduced her to my now husband when we started dating in college. He is from a different country than I am, and I live in his country. After we had been dating a few years, my visa was about to expire, and in order to live in one place, we decided to get married. We were still young and fresh out of university, so we decided to elope quietly. We planned to get legally married at a courthouse, announce an engagement, and have a proper wedding a few years later, since legal documents and wedding ceremonies are separate in my husband's country. No one knew our plan. We were wildly in love and thrilled to share such a secret just between the two of us. Looking back, it was unnecessary because no one would have judged us. But at the time, we were young and foolish. We flew to my home country to visit my parents and announce our engagement, and my dad picked us up from the airport. While talking in the car, he mentioned that my Nana had been very upset when he visited her the other day, the exact day we decided to elope. She had told the whole family that she dreamed I had eloped and was already married. Everyone dismissed it because it seemed impossible, but she kept insisting and was incredibly lucid, even raising her voice, something she had not done since before the stroke. My dad told us because he thought it was sweet that she was so concerned and suddenly so clear-minded. My husband and I went completely silent, and I felt cold all over. We have no idea how she knew or if it was pure coincidence. When we visited her a few days later, she did not remember it at all and was simply thrilled that we were engaged. We are happily married now and had our wedding, and no one ever found out we eloped before the wedding day, except my Nana, apparently. Story 7. When I was in high school, my uncle would give me a couple of dollars to help babysit his kids with my aunt. They lived in a 2-story house by the water in a nice area. The kids were about 3 and 6 years old. One day I was sitting in their den on my phone when I started hearing a baby crying. Thinking it was the 3-year-old, I went to the bottom of the stairs to see if my aunt was upstairs dealing with it. I called for her a few times but got no response. The baby kept crying. I called out one more time, and when there was still no answer, I started walking up the stairs. That was when I heard my cousins and my aunt laughing and playing outside. Every hair on my body stood up, and I felt a chill run straight down my spine. I quietly turned around, walked back down the stairs, got into my car, and drove away. The baby was still crying when I closed the door behind me. A few years later, while drunk at a family party, I told my uncle the story. He told me that he and his wife used to hear the baby too, and that the previous owners had lost a child to sudden infant death syndrome in that upstairs room. He is very Catholic and had a mass said for the baby, and after that it never happened again. It still gives me chills every time I think about it. Story 8. I lived in an old apartment in 2002. The place was built in 1900, so it was just over 100 years old when I moved in. The living room and kitchen were fine, but the bathroom and bedroom were unnerving, like I always felt I was being watched, especially in the bedroom if the closet door was open. Those feelings slowly became something I just lived with as I settled in. I felt safe in the bedroom, but only if the door was locked. One night I was fast asleep when there was a loud bang on my bedroom door. When I finally worked up the courage to get out of bed, I checked the apartment and all the windows were closed and locked from the inside. The door still had the chain secured and no one was there. As for the closet in the bedroom, I never liked going in it, and I never liked leaving the door open. For some reason, I would hear gasping noises in my head, so I always kept it closed. About a month or more after being woken by the bang, I was asleep again when something woke me up, a pressure on my body like I was being held down. It was pitch black in the room, and I could not see anything, but I knew something was standing over me. When I finally managed to turn on the bedside lamp, nothing was there. After that, I could not sleep in the dark and always kept a light on. That moment scared the life out of me, and the feeling of being watched only got stronger after that. Friends who visited would comment on how uncomfortable the bathroom felt, like someone was watching them. It became so uncomfortable that when I had the chance to move to another unit, I took it immediately, packed up, and left. After me, several people rented that apartment, and each moved out within months. I became friendly with the building manager and told him I thought the place was haunted, which he laughed off. Years later during renovations, I went to see the apartment again, and it looked nicer and felt less creepy. While talking with the building owner, he casually mentioned that a former tenant had committed suicide by hanging themselves in the closet, and that the original designer of the building had lived in that unit and died there as well. I was not angry when I heard that, but I felt validated that what I experienced had been real. Story 9. I currently live in a haunted house. I have heard voices and footsteps. Lights have turned on and off by themselves, and one of the ghosts seems obsessed with silverware, because I constantly hear it clattering in the drawer, and sometimes knives end up in the wrong slot. The strangest and scariest experience happened the very first night I spent there. I had not finished moving in. There were boxes everywhere, and I did not even have my mattress set up yet. I was lying on an old futon mattress watching a video on my phone when I felt the pins and needles sensation of something falling asleep. Except it was not my feet, it was on the top of my head in the shape of a hand. I said goodnight out loud, turned off the light, and tried to sleep. When I woke up, my closet door was ajar, but everything else was untouched. I guess whoever my unseen roommate is just wanted to check me out on my first night. Story 10. During my freshman year at university, there was a creepy old dorm on campus that no one lived in. Everyone avoided it because it gave off an uncomfortable feeling, like you were being watched. There were rumors that 2 women had died there on separate occasions, one by murder and one by suicide, and that they haunted the building. One night a friend of mine was in a terrible mood after his girlfriend broke up with him, so I walked around campus with him to let him vent and hopefully feel better. We walked past the dorm and I brought up the haunting stories to distract him. The bottom floor had 2 doors on opposite sides with a hallway running the entire length of the building so you could see from one end to the other. We stood by a window looking down the hall when 2 girls walked out of a room wearing clothes that looked like they were from the 1970s or 1980s, and they stood there looking at each other without speaking. One girl slowly turned her head and looked straight at us, then slowly turned back and walked away down the hall. We ran to the other side of the building but could not find them. When we returned to the original door, we watched the same thing happen all over again. We looked at each other and ran. That experience shook me badly, especially later that night when I was in my room and all my posters fell off the wall at the same time. After telling another friend, He convinced me to go back with him and try to get inside. We found an open window, which we later learned was the room where the girl had hung herself, and climbed in. As we wandered the halls, strange things kept happening. Faucets turning on by themselves, chairs being moved between rooms, and on the first floor, a desk was flipped upside down under the stairwell. As we prepared to leave, more faucets began turning on, growing louder and louder. When we reached the window and put our hands on it to climb out, the door slammed shut behind us. We tore it open, jumped out the window, ran back to our dorm, and never went back again. Story 11. I am sure this will get buried, but I have one. It is more bittersweet spooky than outright terrifying, but here it goes. My ex had this lamp that sat on the island in our kitchen. She turned it on almost every night, and in the mornings when she made coffee, it was just a solid little lamp that always worked. Late in our relationship, I brought my cat to live with us because my ex had dogs, and my cat was pretty old and not used to them, so I wanted to spare her that stress. She ended up loving the spot near where that lamp plugged into the outlet on the island wall, and she would lie there all the time. Not long after I brought her over, she passed away, and I was completely heartbroken and had a hard time accepting the loss. About a week after my cat died, my ex was grinding coffee in a small electric grinder when I heard her scream from the other room. I rushed in to see what was wrong, and she told me she felt something cold brush past her feet, and then the lamp started flickering. She tried to make it happen again to show me, but it did not. I brushed it off as her being weird early in the morning. A few days later, she asked me to make coffee for her. I grabbed the grinder, turned on the lamp so I could see, and the exact same thing happened to me. A cold rush swept past my feet, just like a cat weaving around them, and the lamp flickered before I even started the grinder. It never happened before or after that, despite the hundreds of times I used the grinder in the same outlet as that lamp. I like to think it was my little girl saying goodbye one last time. Story 12. I came home from work one day to grab my spare tires. My sister was away at school about 7 hours away, and neither of my parents were going to be home for at least another 5 hours. I ran inside, changed my clothes, grabbed the tires, and drove to a garage to get them installed. I got home about 2 hours later, and when I walked into the living room, there was a chair sitting right in the middle of the hallway facing the front door. I did not think much of it at first, but I also did not recognize it as one of ours. It was a basic metal folding chair, the kind you would buy cheaply at a store. I folded it up and leaned it against my dad's workbench in the garage. A couple of hours later, my mom got home, and I casually asked her why she had left a metal chair in the middle of the hallway. She told me we did not own any metal chairs, and that she had not been home until about an hour earlier. I told her that when I came back from the garage, the chair had been sitting there in the hallway. She asked me to show it to her, and when I went out to the garage, it was gone. I searched everywhere but could not find it. I swore to her that I was not on drugs and that I had not imagined it. She thought it was strange but did not dwell on it. I never saw that chair again, and I have no idea where it came from or where it went. Story 13. This happened in a house we lived in for about 7 years. A lot of strange things happened there. Voices murmuring from time to time, a shadow person I once saw, and even seeing someone briefly stick their head into a room. None of it felt hostile, but there was a different feeling that my mother and I both shared whenever we went out front at night. We both felt like something was watching us, and it did not feel friendly. One night around midnight, I decided to drive to the 24-hour grocery store because I wanted some snacks. As I stepped out the front door, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye and turned to look. There was a very tall figure floating outside my brother's window, for lack of a better word, almost like it was hanging, even though nothing was holding it up. It looked like it was covered in a sheet that had once been white, but was now dirty and off-white, growing darker with mud and dirt the farther down it went. I could not see any feet, eyes, or face, but I knew it was staring at my brother's window. When I stared at it, it turned to look at me, and I felt completely frozen, like a pinned insect in a display. Its gaze felt like it was physically holding me in place. It only lasted a second or two, but it felt much longer. Then it turned back toward the window. The pressure vanished, and it disappeared. Right after it vanished, I heard wings flutter in the tree above, and one of the neighborhood owls landed there. In a strange way, it felt like the owl came to my defense. Our cul-de-sac loved those owls and treated them like neighbors, so maybe it was just being protective. That is how I like to think about it. Either way, I decided it was probably better to just stay home and make some popcorn that night. Now that I think about it, I never told my brother about what I saw. Story 14. When I was about 12, I was at my cousin's house. He was around 9, messing around on their trampoline. It was an older neighborhood and kind of run down. My cousin and I got the bright idea to sneak into the old abandoned house on the other side of his fence. We climbed the fence, walked along a narrow path between the fence and the side of the house, completely barefoot for some reason, and went around to the front. The front door was surprisingly modern, a steel door with a lock on it. We tried it and it opened. As soon as we went inside, the smell hit us like a wall, a sweet, sickly odor that filled the entire house. So we held our noses as we walked through. There was no broken glass on the floor, which was lucky given our bare feet, but there was a thick layer of dust everywhere. It was a shotgun-style house with maybe 4 small rooms. In the front room, there were 6 or 7 mountain bikes, which made us think someone might just be using the place for storage. Off that room was the bathroom, and inside were a bunch of small old glass bottles that looked like they dated back to around the 1940s. The second room had more junk, but what stood out was an old cassette player with a tape still inside. The label on the tape read, Deborah, March 18th, 1993. But we did not think much of it. The third room had more bikes and clutter, and a tiny closet off to the side. We brushed away the cobwebs and saw nothing except a chainsaw with a dark red-brown residue on it. Alarm bells started going off in our heads, and even though we tried to convince ourselves it was just rust, we decided to quickly check the fourth room and leave. The fourth room was completely empty except for some stairs leading down to the basement, a heavy layer of dust, and a small wooden cross. Painted on it were the words Deborah, September 29th, 1963 to March 18th, 1993. Then we heard a thump from the basement. We ran. We ran out the front door, down the path, climbed the fence, tore through my cousin's backyard, into his house, up the stairs into his room, and hid under the bed. We stayed there for hours, whispering, speculating, and promising never to go back there again. We did go back, though, but that is another story for another day. Story 15. My high school used to be a giant mansion before it was converted into an orphanage and later into a high school. One section of the building, known as the third floor, was completely inaccessible. The staircase that led up to it had been blocked off with wood and painted black to match the chorus room where it was located. In 2003, during the fall school production of Les Miserables, the wood was removed so the windows on that third floor could be replaced, and some of those removed windows even ended up being used for our stage barricade. We had play practice most nights, and if you lived far enough away, it was easier to stay at the school, rather than go home and come back. One night while waiting for practice to start, 3 friends and I decided to go up the staircase to explore the third floor. The steps were rotted and falling apart from years of disuse, so we went up carefully one at a time. At the top, we found an unremarkable hallway with a few boring rooms on either side, all leading into a large open area filled with stacked desks and folders of old test papers from around the 1980s. We were disappointed because the rumor was that this part of the school had never been renovated after its orphanage days and that the ghosts of orphaned children haunted it. Since nothing scary happened, we started digging through the old papers. While one friend was in a side room with her back to us, another friend quietly pushed 2 of us into a nearby room so we could hide and scare her into thinking we had vanished. She came running out yelling at us, clearly angry, and we were barely holding in our laughter when suddenly someone in the room giggled like a little girl. I looked at the others, expecting one of them to have ruined the joke, but both had their hands over their mouths and looked absolutely terrified. The room we were hiding in was tiny, about the size of a small one-stall bathroom, and someone else was giggling in there with us. The entire sequence had taken maybe 10 seconds, and it was late afternoon, with no one else in the chorus classroom all day. We would have seen or heard anyone go upstairs. Whoever giggled was already up there. Before we could process it, another round of giggling started, this time from more than one voice. That was enough for one of my friends, a big tough former athlete, who let out the highest pitched scream I have ever heard from someone his size. He bolted out of the room, ran down the hallway, scared our other friend half to death, and we all ran down the stairs together as chunks of rotted wood fell off beneath us. Later, the maintenance staff lectured us about going up there because of safety issues, which only encouraged other students to sneak up, hoping to see something. There were more stories that year, but they stopped once the windows were replaced and the third floor was sealed again. The school is closed now, so whatever was up there is free to roam without interruption. Story 16. About 5 years and 2 boyfriends ago, I moved into an old farmhouse with my then significant other. He was a hoarder and deeply embarrassed by the condition of the house after his wife left him. He owned a recreational vehicle and slept in it because every room of the house was filled knee-high with garbage, clothes, and boxes. I am extremely distressed by clutter, so I cleaned that house. I cleaned everything, right down to the cobweb-filled corners of the ceiling. It took weeks, but I polished every inch of wood and filled his truck with more than 10 loads of trash. The very first night I stayed there, things already felt strange. At that point, I had only cleared part of the living room. My boyfriend snored unbearably loud, so I chose to sleep inside on the couch while he slept in the camper. I had just had an argument with my mother and was lying awake around 4 in the morning, upset and unable to sleep, when I heard my boyfriend come in through the back door, muttering to himself like he always did. I heard drawers and cabinets opening and closing in the kitchen and assumed he was looking for something. Since I was already awake, I got up to see if I could help him. The kitchen was only about 5 feet away, but when I walked in, no one was there. I looked around and called for him, but there was no answer. I was not scared at that point, just curious, so I went out to the camper and could hear him snoring heavily before I even reached the door. I woke him and gently asked what he had needed in the house, and he told me he had not left the camper all night. I assumed he had been sleepwalking, but when I went back inside, I noticed it had lightly snowed during the night, and the only footprints leading to the camper were mine. A couple of days later, I moved my 2 cats in, and they were extremely on edge, growling and acting out of character, especially at night. I dismissed it as stress from a new environment. I had finally made the bedroom livable, but they refused to cross the threshold into it. The first night we slept in the bedroom was when I truly began to fear the house. The bed was pushed against a window facing the cornfield, and my boyfriend insisted on sleeping on the outside of the bed, leaving me pressed against the window. I was overwhelmed with a horrible feeling that something was right outside, to the point of tears, but he told me I was being dramatic, even though I am usually calm and logical. I slept on the couch instead. The next day, I noticed a handprint on the top of the bedroom window that I had cleaned the day before. When I held my hand up to it, it was 3 times larger than mine and stretched downward, as if something had dragged its hand along the glass. The print was more than 9 feet off the ground, directly above an open coal cellar. When I showed my boyfriend, he told me his ex-wife had thought something was wrong with the house too. She once had a full conversation with him while cooking dinner, only to turn around and see him pulling into the driveway. He brushed everything off and told me I was paranoid, and I ignored my instincts. Then one spring morning, I woke up at 4:46, checked my phone, and quietly got back into bed. The bedroom was filled with early sunlight. Because of my fear of spiders, the bed was pulled about 5 inches away from the wall. I tucked my arm under the pillow with my hand hanging over the edge. In the moment I closed my eyes, an icy cold hand grabbed my wrist and yanked it down hard. I screamed, shook my boyfriend awake, and asked if he was messing with me. He was not. I called a close friend, who reminded me there was a cemetery visible from my bedroom window. She came over with sage and we smudged the house, laughing nervously the whole time. But after that, nothing strange happened again. The relationship eventually ended and I moved out, though we remain friends. And he says nothing unusual has happened since I left. Story 17. My wife and I stayed at a nice hotel in downtown Pittsburgh, where I asked her to marry me after a lavish dinner. I chose the room because it had a massive Japanese soaking tub that I, a 6'1" man, could barely see over. The first night we stayed there, we were sleeping in the king bed, and I remember glancing at the alarm clock and seeing it was around 2 or 3 in the morning. To my left, just a few feet away, I heard a sound exactly like a pencil slowly rolling down a sloped surface. It was deliberate and loud enough to wake both of us. My heart jumped. but I quickly convinced myself it was just a pencil rolling off a desk and went back to sleep. The next morning, I realized there were no pencils in the room and no desk at all. The only writing tools were capped ballpoint pens, which could not have made that distinct wooden rolling sound, and there was no sloped surface anywhere in the room. It was strange enough that we talked about it that morning. I do not believe in ghosts, but I enjoy unexplained things and assumed there had to be a logical explanation. That night we were both soaking in the tub, the water up to my chin, enjoying the warmth in the middle of a cold February. We were laughing and splashing when suddenly the room filled with the buzzing sound of a microphone connected to a public address system, like feedback before an announcement. Our hearts started pounding. Then we heard the unmistakable sound of someone blowing into a microphone to test it, a deep whooshing sound that was impossible to misidentify. My heart raced. I jumped out of the tub, wrapped myself in a towel, and said out loud that it sounded like a man testing a microphone. My wife stayed frozen in the tub. I searched the room and found no speakers, no vents, no hidden grills, nothing that could have produced the sound. The only speaker present was an iHome playing music from my phone. We still had another night to stay, and between our engagement excitement and the strange events, it felt unforgettable. A week later, I emailed the hotel asking about the building's history. They replied that it had once been an old telephone factory. I do not know why that explanation resonated so strongly with me, but it immediately brought to mind drafting tables, public address systems, and the sounds of a working factory, echoes of another life the building once had. Story 18. In high school, my friends and I were messing around with a Ouija board one night. We had used it before, and nothing remarkable had ever happened. And we mostly did it to try to scare each other or our girlfriends, because we all thought it was a joke. That night, there was no one else home except the seven of us, and we were all sitting together around the board. One of the girls there wanted to try it, and she had never done it before. This time felt different. The board misspelled certain words the exact same way every time, and it gave answers that seemed strangely accurate about the history of our town, things we neither knew nor cared about. Long story short, the spirit claimed it was a 10-year-old boy who had died on the property in the 1800s and was buried there in an unmarked grave, since my friend's house sat on a farm at the edge of town. We were all pretty unsettled because the board had never been that detailed or consistent before, but we were still skeptical and assumed one of us was messing with the rest. Finally, my friend asked if the spirit could do something to prove it was really there with us. The planchette moved to yes, and then spelled out knock. Then it stopped moving completely. We all stared at the board in silence, and then there was a sharp rap, rap, rap on the window right next to us. The outside lights were on, and there was absolutely no one there. We never touched that board again. Story 19, I was 17 and working at my great-grandmother's house. She was very old, her name was Constance, and she had not walked in years. She had just turned 100 years old and spent most of her time lying in bed. She lived in an old schoolhouse she had called home for around 60 years, with an incredible view of the river, one of the best in the whole town, even though she was almost completely blind. She always told stories about children from the school playing in her front garden, and sometimes spoke about strange things from her past. One morning while visiting her, I asked if there were any jobs that needed doing around the house. She told me to tidy up the garden. Next to her porch was a very narrow pathway between the house and an embankment, and when I looked down it, I noticed it was full of leaves. Above it were branches and greenery, so I grabbed a rake and gloves and started clearing it. The path was only about 10 meters long, but as I went down, it seemed to curve behind the house and led into a strange open space about 5 by 5 feet in size. There was no obvious way to reach it except the path I had taken, and built into the wall was a door, not part of the house itself, covered in ferns. I cleared them away and saw writing on the door that read, "Games Room." That made some sense because the building had once been a school, but then I noticed the door had a sturdy padlock attached to very old metal. I tried it and it would not budge, but there was a small hole in the door. I used my phone light to look inside and saw what appeared to be another wooden layer behind it. I went back inside and asked my great-grandmother about it, showing her the photo I took, which she did not recognize. She told me the games room had been under the stairs near the door, and that there were 2 rooms out back that were only storage, and she did not remember a games room there. She said those rooms were built into the embankment, So I went back out, climbed up using the wall inside of the house, and found two old cellar-style wooden doors. The locks were so rusty I could pull them off, and inside was just an empty storage space with some old fabric on the ground. I asked my grandmother, Constance's daughter, and she knew nothing about the room with the padlocked door despite growing up there. When I showed it to her, she only remarked that it was peculiar and suggested we go back inside. To this day, it still unsettles me that this tiny locked room built into the wall existed, hidden from view, remembered by no one, completely detached and swallowed by branches and leaves. Story 20. When my daughter was 7 years old, she kept asking me why I was smoking in her room late at night. I was a smoker at the time, but I never smoked in her room and never smoked upstairs at all. I told her repeatedly that I was not smoking in her room at any time, but she insisted that someone was coming in, sitting on her bed and smoking. I was unsettled but knew no one was sneaking into our house just to smoke in my daughter's bedroom. The house had previously belonged to relatives of my daughter's teacher, and when the teacher asked her how she liked the new house, my daughter said she loved it, but that someone smoked in her room at night and her mom swore it was not her. During a parent conference, the teacher pulled me aside and asked which bedroom my daughter slept in. When I told her, she explained that her mother-in-law had lived in that house and was not allowed to smoke due to health issues, so she would sneak into that bedroom late at night to have a few cigarettes. My daughter's bed was right where her favorite secret smoking spot had been. We joked that we lived peacefully with Hazel the ghost for quite some time. She had a habit of putting things back where she thought they belonged, but otherwise she was harmless. Hazel had said in life that she had no intention of leaving her house even after death, and after I firmly asked her to stop smoking in my daughter's room, the problem ended. Story 21. When I was in high school, my group of friends spent a lot of time at one particular friend's house because it was huge. It was also an old house, but his parents were relaxed and let us take over when we were there, cooking dinner for 10 people, staying up late listening to music and playing video games, and they never minded. One evening, we were all sitting in his room watching television. It was dark outside, the lights were on, and the curtains were open. Suddenly, two different people on opposite sides of the room jumped at the same time and started looking around. Both of them said they had seen someone walk across the room in the reflection in the window, even though we were on the second floor and no one in the room had moved. It freaked a few of the girls out, and we had to calm them down. A couple of weeks later, we found a pack of cards in the house that had letters on them, and someone suggested we use them as a makeshift Ouija board to see if the house was actually haunted. We found a big wooden board, arranged the letter cards in a circle with two homemade yes and no cards, put a glass in the middle, and started asking questions. It answered, saying it was a man who had lived in the house and died there. When we asked when he died, it answered long. We asked if he was moving the glass, and it said yes. This is where I made a mistake and asked if he could move something other than the glass. It answered yes. We all paused and listened, but nothing happened. We asked if he had moved something, and it said yes again, but still nothing obvious happened. This was around 10:30 in the evening. After a while, we said goodbye properly and eventually went home, unsettled but also kind of enjoying it. I walked home with a friend who lived nearby, and when I walked into my house, my mom warned me to be careful in my room because a mirror had fallen off the wall earlier, and they were not sure if all the glass had been cleaned up. When I asked when it happened, she said around 10:30, the exact time I had asked the spirit to move something. I did not sleep well that night. Story 22. I am from Scotland, and when I was a child, my parents took my sister and me on a trip to Fort William in the Highlands. People usually go there for skiing and hiking, and since it was not winter, we were there for light hiking and stayed for a couple of nights. I do not remember the name of the hotel, but I remember it was old-fashioned, and we all slept in one room. There was a single bed where I slept, a double bed in the middle for my parents, and another single bed on the other side for my sister. I was a very anxious child and was especially scared of the dark and the idea of ghosts, so I often struggled to sleep. That first night I remember lying awake for a long time, tossing and turning, before lying on my back and trying to calm myself. Suddenly I felt the bed sink slightly near my feet and heard the creak of the old mattress. Someone was sitting at the foot of my bed. My heart was racing because I had not heard my parents or sister get up. Whatever it was then shifted and sat directly on my feet. I felt the weight, heard the mattress creak again, and my feet became ice cold. It moved off my feet and settled near them again, and the mattress creaked once more. Within seconds, I felt the coldest sensation I have ever experienced. Not all over my body, but slowly rising from my feet upward, accompanied by a heavy pressure. I was too frightened to open my eyes and tried to force myself to call out for my mum, but I could not at first. When I finally managed to shout and wake everyone, the cold and pressure had reached my knees. As soon as the lights were turned on, the feeling vanished. I have never had an explanation for what happened. My dad slept in that bed the next night, and I stayed awake all night in the double bed with my mum. Story 23. I was visiting my parents one summer while I was in college. I was taking a nap on the couch in their living room around 11 in the morning with the television on when I was woken by the sound of a doorknob upstairs being jiggled aggressively. Their doors had old-style knobs that locked by pushing in and turning, and I assumed my dad had accidentally locked himself in a room, something he had done before. I went upstairs and found that all the doors were wide open. I felt a little uneasy but convinced myself I had imagined the sound while half asleep. I went back downstairs, turned off the television, and fell asleep again. About an hour later, I was woken up again by the sound of a doorknob jiggling, this time on the opposite side of the house upstairs. I went back up and once again all the doors were wide open. I called my parents at work, since they ran an automobile service station, and asked if either of them had been home that day. Both said they had been at work the entire time. I left the house immediately. It never happened again, and that was about 6 years ago. Around the same time, a friend and I were helping my parents move into that house and carrying boxes into a small room above the attached garage that they planned to use for storage. While moving things into a small closet in that room, we noticed a bookcase inside with a note saying we could keep it. When we moved it, we saw the top of a doorway hidden behind it. Eventually, we checked it out and found it only led to the attic and nothing was inside. But at the time, it was incredibly unsettling. Story 24. I want to preface this by saying that I consider myself a very rational person, and I understand that there has to be some explanation for what happened, even if I do not know what it is. When I was 11, I went to a summer camp-type place with my class for 4 days. I do not remember the name, but I clearly remember that almost all of us kids felt immediate strange vibes when we arrived. A lot of kids woke up crying and wanting to go home. There were meltdowns and the overall mood was not fun, even though it should have been. Kids wandered off into the woods and even the camp counselors seemed miserable. One night I woke up to tapping on the window. At first I thought it was a branch, but the tapping followed a rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. Once I realized it was not random, I became more scared than I had ever been in my life. I wondered if we were being pranked by another cabin, so I ran to the small nook where our counselor slept and tried to wake him up. The clock next to him showed it was deep into the early morning, around 3. He woke up angry and told me to go back to bed. At that point, I knew it was not a prank. I went back to my bed, and shortly after, the tapping started again. Eventually, it stopped, but I was too terrified to sleep. The next day, everything felt wrong. It is normal for kids to be scared, but I found myself questioning my own mortality in a way that felt far too intense for an 11-year-old. I refused to go canoeing because I was convinced we would die, and whenever I was near the woods, I felt an overwhelming urge to walk deep into them, which terrified me even more. This was not normal childhood fear. It felt like a deep existential acceptance of my own death. The entire trip I could not relax, and even on the bus ride home I was convinced something terrible would happen. I did not feel normal for weeks afterward. Everyone I asked denied experiencing anything. The other cabins had no idea what I was talking about, and there was no evidence of pranking. The space outside the window had no branches. Maybe it was an animal. I honestly do not know, but I have never been able to explain it. Story 25. When I was about 10 years old, 4 of my cousins were living with us, and I also had 2 siblings, so there were 7 kids in the house. We were all sitting in a circle in the family room playing a game while my parents were out running errands. Suddenly, we all heard a voice clearly call out Zachary. It was unmistakably the voice of our grandmother, and one of my cousins was named Zach. None of us had heard the front door open, and our parents had not said they were picking up our grandmother. But we all jumped up and ran out of the room to greet her. That was when we realized our parents were not home, and our grandmother was not there either. We checked the house, went outside, and even looked around the neighbors' yards, but no one was there. We were completely baffled. That house had other strange occurrences over the years, but this one stood out because all seven of us heard it clearly. Story 26, I was living in a house in Florida with three other guys. The house belonged to one friend, who I will call Jason. He had lived there as a child with his family before they moved to California, and later he moved back into the house with another friend, Carl, while attending college. Jason and Carl had been living there for about a year before I moved in, along with another friend, Mike. A few months before moving in, I flew to Florida to visit them and noticed some strange things during that week. Figures moving at the edges of my vision and small items shifting around. Nothing I could not dismiss as imagination at the time. After I moved in, the weirdness became harder to ignore. A few days in, I set up an air mattress in my room and fully inflated it with a battery-powered pump, securing the cap tightly. We all left to get food and came back to find the mattress completely deflated with the cap removed, flattened as if all the air had been deliberately removed. Anyone who has ever packed one of those knows how difficult it is to get all the air out. I also kept noticing small objects not where I left them and continued seeing movement in my peripheral vision. Over time, I began noticing a child-sized shadow figure with no features, but only in reflections or at the edges of my sight, never directly. Another recurring thing was that sometimes when I was in the bathroom, I would hear a soft knocking low on the door. After a few weeks, I mentioned the knocking and the shadow figure to Jason and Carl. They exchanged frightened looks and told me they had been experiencing the same things. Jason admitted that he and his brother had noticed these things when they lived in the house as children, and that they used to hear disembodied giggling coming from the room I was staying in. At that point, I knew I was not imagining it. Story 27. At my mom's place, the garage is detached from the house, and I went out to grab some drinks from the beer fridge while I waited for my boyfriend to come over. As I was walking the 6 or so feet to the garage, a bird suddenly started attacking me, flapping its wings directly at my head. I panicked and ran back inside. Once I was safely indoors, the bird flew to the back of the house and stared at me through the window, chirping nonstop. I was absolutely terrified at that point and waited anxiously for my boyfriend to arrive. When he did, we tried to scare the bird off, but it kept trying to attack whenever I stepped outside. So we ended up stunning it briefly with a cooking pan just to make it stop. The only explanation I could come up with was that I had wandered too close to its nest, which seemed strange because nothing like that had ever happened before. And while we live somewhat outside town, it is not deep in the woods. A few days later, my parents and I were all inexplicably watching our neighbor arrive home from work through the window. As she got out of her car, a bird suddenly flew up from the ground and landed right on her arm. We all thought it was extremely unsettling, especially given what had happened to me earlier that week. A few more days passed and I was with my boyfriend on the 4th of July when my mom called me, which was unusual since we normally just text. She told me that our neighbor's husband had died in a car accident. The cause of the crash was that a bird had flown into his window while he was driving, causing him to lose control of the vehicle. This happened several years ago, and my parents and I still get chills thinking about it. Story 28. The house I lived in from about 13 until I was 24 had a darkness to it. My parents told me that the previous owner's son had overdosed somewhere else, not in the house, but that knowledge always unsettled me. Throughout the years I lived there, I experienced all the classic signs people associate with a haunted house. We had a glass cube wall, very 1980s in style, separating the living room from the dining room, and late at night when I stayed up watching movies or gaming, I would see shadows rushing past on the other side. Every time I went to check, no one else was awake. One night when I was around 15, I woke up suddenly in my room. I had an old laptop that emitted a faint blue light when closed, just enough for me to squint and check the time on my wristwatch beside it. As I was doing that, I heard something whisper my name right next to my ear, as if it was standing an inch from me. I bolted out of bed, knocked things over as I scrambled out of the room, and did not stop to listen for anything else. I ran straight to the living room and passed out on the couch until morning. For several nights after that, I barely slept, waiting for it to speak again, but it never did. The house also had a camera system installed, and I remember seeing strange things on it, like the back fence door opening on its own, even though it had two clip locks. It could have been strong wind, but the way the door moved filled me with dread. I cannot explain it logically, but it was something I felt deep in my bones, and I learned to live with that feeling for years. Story 29. This happened about 1 week ago. I had scheduled an appointment to view an apartment in a quieter, more industrial part of town. It was not a bad area, just out of the way, with very little foot traffic. I waited about 30 minutes for the real estate agent, but she never showed up, and since it was freezing, I left. I made the first right turn out of the neighborhood and stopped at a red light about a block down. As I pulled up, I noticed what looked like a man and his small child, a little boy no more than 4 or 5, walking toward a small cafe. The man stopped short and went into a liquor store on the corner, leaving the child behind. As I came to a full stop, I could see the boy clearly. He was holding a tiny green book, appeared to be of Asian descent, had shoulder-length black hair blowing violently in the wind, and he was crying. It was the kind of crying children do when they realize they are lost. I saw another man approaching and assumed he might be the child's father, but he walked right past without acknowledging him. I watched for another 10 seconds as the boy walked up to the cafe window and peered inside, clearly looking for someone. No one noticed him. When he turned around, we locked eyes for about 5 seconds. He stood there in a thin blue windbreaker in freezing weather, clutching his little green book tightly. I decided I would pull over once the light turned green and wait with him until someone came back. At that exact moment, a sport utility vehicle pulled up beside me and blocked my view, though I could still hear the boy crying. The light turned green almost immediately. I turned on my hazard lights to pull over, but when the vehicle drove off, the boy was gone. I checked the cafe, then the liquor store, but he was nowhere. He had simply vanished, and I drove home in complete silence, trying to understand what I had just seen. Story 30. Growing up on an Indian reservation, almost everyone has a spooky story. I have had a few strange experiences, but nothing too extreme. One of the best stories I ever heard came from one of my uncles when he was younger. He grew up on the Standing Rock Reservation, specifically in Fort Yates. South of Fort Yates, on the South Dakota side, there is a town called Mobridge, about 30 miles away. When the weather is nice, people from Fort Yates will sometimes walk that entire distance to Mobridge for the bars, usually catching a ride for part of the way. It is an ugly county road, and because alcoholism is so common in the area, there have been many drunk driving deaths along it. One morning after a night of drinking, my uncle was walking back from Mobridge. It was around 6 in the morning, and he figured he had slept enough to be sober enough to walk. He said he had been walking for about an hour when he came over a hill and saw a girl walking out of a field toward the road to meet him. She was native, dressed in regular jeans and everyday clothes, and very pretty, so he assumed she was just someone walking to or from town. She started talking to him, asking if he was hungry, telling him he looked tired, and saying he should come with her to her home to eat and rest. When he asked where she lived, since he could not see a house, she pointed toward some trees about a mile away. He assumed the house was just hidden behind them. He said she nearly convinced him to go with her, but then he looked down and saw that her feet were turned completely backward. He froze, stopped talking, and turned around to walk back toward Mobridge. She followed him, telling him he was going to die on that road and that he should come back with her, that it would be warm, and he could sleep with her. He ignored her and kept walking without saying a word. He said she followed him for about 10 or 15 minutes until a car coming from Fort Yates stopped and picked him up. As he was getting into the car, she kept telling him not to go, saying he would die in a car accident. Once they started driving, he asked the people in the car if they had heard what she said, but they told him he had been walking alone. In our culture, there are beings whose name roughly translates to tree witch, and he was completely convinced that was what had been speaking to him that morning. Story 31. We moved into an old 3-story house that had been built around the turn of the century. According to the deeds, it had been owned by a single woman for many years before being sold to a man, and then to us, my husband, my grandmother, and me. The house needed a lot of work, but luckily our next-door neighbor was a builder. He came over regularly to help while my grandmother was visiting my parents in another city. On the final day of work, He casually mentioned that my grandmother was always outside working in the garden and that it looked lovely. After questioning him more, I realized he had been seeing a white-haired woman walking past the back bedroom window in the garden. It could not have been my grandmother, as she was over 100 miles away at the time. I never corrected him because he was extremely superstitious, and I worried he would refuse to come back if he knew. In that same house, while we were eating dinner one evening, I looked up and saw what appeared to be a huge black hooded figure ducking behind the hallway doorframe, as if it had been peering into the room. It was so large it seemed to crouch to fit, and it vanished the moment I looked directly at it. The dogs had started whining just before I noticed it, which made it even more terrifying. I never walked down that corridor again with the lights turned off. Story 32. When I was in high school, there was an old, dilapidated plantation-style mansion that had been abandoned for years, and my friends and I would go there occasionally to scare ourselves. I probably went 3 or 4 times during those years. We called it the Austin House because it was near Austin, Florida. This place was genuinely terrifying, like something out of a Stephen King nightmare. It sat deep in a swampy forest, surrounded by massive moss-covered oak trees that blocked out the stars, with thick undergrowth and constant animal noises that made nighttime feel unreal. I do not know who lived there or how long it had been abandoned, but it had been a very long time. The floors had holes, the staircases were dangerous, and it was not a safe place to be, especially alone. Inside the house were red-painted pentagrams, detailed satanic goats, candles, and ritualistic symbols that looked far more deliberate than simple vandalism by bored kids. One night, bored and looking for thrills, we decided to go back. You could barely see the house through the trees from the dirt road as we approached, and it was completely silent except for our flashlights cutting through the darkness. As we got closer, with the house in view the entire time, we suddenly noticed a lit candle burning in a top third-floor window. We would have seen it earlier, which meant someone had likely been watching us and lit it once we got close. The thought of unseen people standing in pitch-black silence, deliberately letting us know they were there, terrified us. We turned around immediately and left, and none of us ever went back. Years later, I heard the county finally demolish the house. Story 34. The house I grew up in was fairly old, and my dad did extensive renovations to it over the years. I always felt uneasy about the attic, which was a full third story, and eventually my dad converted it into a small 2-bedroom apartment for me and my older brother. One night when I was around 13 and everyone else was asleep, I heard 3 loud bangs on the wall right next to my head. An important detail is that the staircase ran along the other side of that wall in a traditional Victorian layout, with a landing and a turn, meaning the spot where the bangs came from was about 8 feet off the ground. Immediately after the banging stopped, the touch lamp beside my bed began cycling through all of its settings on its own, off, dim, bright, and brightest, over and over for about 30 seconds. At the same time, out in the open living area, our stereo suddenly turned on at full volume, blasting a punk album I had recently discovered. I ran out of my room and shut the stereo off as fast as I could so I would not wake my family, then went back to my room and sat there with the light on until I eventually fell asleep. That was the creepiest experience I ever had in that house, though it was far from the only strange one. Story 35. I was exploring a historic abandoned apartment complex that had been left in rough shape after a large fire. I felt deeply uneasy the entire time, which was unusual for me because exploring abandoned places was normally routine. As we were about to leave, we noticed the basement and decided to take a quick look. The moment we stepped into the basement from the staircase, we heard extremely loud, slow footsteps directly above us on the first floor. It sounded like a single person wearing very heavy boots, walking calmly back and forth. It did not sound rushed at all. We were terrified, standing frozen and listening to our own heartbeats. The strangest part was that we were right next to the entrance, so there was no way someone could have entered without us seeing or hearing them. We listened to the footsteps for about a minute, and when they finally stopped, we found a cracked basement window and climbed out. Outside, there was no one around at all. It remains the creepiest experience I have had in all my years of exploring abandoned places.